All right.
Okay. All right, so, we've talked about the measuring rod, and we talked about last time, the temple, but we didn't go over the scriptures on what is the temple. I forget, what did we talk about last?
We did Psalms 68, was it?
No.
63?
No, it was Isaiah 28.
Oh, Isaiah, yeah.
Yeah, we finished, that's right, we finished up that, okay, and how that ties in with this. Okay, so going back to the temple, and we talked a little bit about this a couple of times ago, because you had brought up about the temple being us. And I want to read some scripture along that lines if we could. What?
It's kind of hard to talk and read at the same time.
Yes, it
We need to read some.
Here it is. This is what I'm looking for. Okay. I want to read this. First, let's go to chapter 11, and let's read verse 2. I'll read it really quick. So we read about the reed, the measuring rod that was given. Oh, let's start at 1. A reed was given, a measuring rod was given to me, which is John, shaped like a staff, and I was told, rise up and measure the sanctuary of God and the altar, and number those who worship there. Verse 2, but leave out of your measuring the court outside the sanctuary of God. Omit that, for it is given over to the Gentiles, and they will trample the holy city under foot for 42 months.
Yours says Gentiles, mine says nation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
The word Gentile actually is going in the Hebrew language. It's the word going. Yes, Goyim.
I love it.
Goyim.
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 Yeah.
Goyim.
Okay.
Goyim.
Goy, they call us goys. Something like G-Y.
Well, and all that means is it can be nations. It can also mean heathens. And it can mean idol worshipers.
Heathens?
And
Heathens.
Heathen.
Yeah, that's what Gentiles really represent, doesn't it? Heathens.
Well, that's what they
So that's
view
a
them
real-
as.
You know, Jews.
Yeah, I said idol worshipers, heathens, nations. And so you have to kind of determine which part of that does it fit. And so even in the word nations, we talked about nations also could represent where God had divided the nations back in, Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 9 is another one where God divided the nations. Remember in the Tower of Babel?
Yeah.
What?
Nothing.
Remember in the Tower of Babel? Everyone spoke the same language, right? And so then when God said, let's go down and see, I forget how it's worded, but he goes on to say that they speak one language lest they could do...
Isn't it in Genesis?
Genesis 11, I believe.
Okay, I'll have to look at there. I'm in Genesis.
Yeah.
Okay, the Tower of Babel, Genesis 11.
Yep.
Come, let us build ourselves. No, that's them.
Where does
Okay.
God say?
And the Lord said, behold, they are one people.
One people.
They
Spoke
have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they propose
That's
to do
right.
will now be impossible for them.
Yes. So he goes down and he divides them up.
Confuse their language.
Yeah, it gives them,
Yeah.
well, when it says he confuses their language, he created different nations. Different languages, different people, different nations. Well, there's also in Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9 is where he places these sons of God, is what it's called in the Hebrew, sons of God, over those nations. They're like demigods.
Yeah. 23, did you say?
32.
Sorry, go ahead.
That
Deuteronomy 32.
lowercase g?
Yeah, lowercase g. Because a lot of people look at them as fallen angels. You could call them angels. They are a created being by God. But remember we talked about that class of angels? They're one of the higher classes of angels. So they're called sons of God. In the Hebrew language, it's B'nai Elohim. That's B-N-E-I Elohim. A-L-O-H.
E-L.
That's what I said.
A. You said A, but it's E.
Oh, I thought it said
No, that's okay. You'll see hello.
E-L-O.
H-I-M.
H-I-M. Okay. So anyway, where was I going? So if you view it along that lines of nations, it can mean, because most of us think, when we just think nations, we just think, oh, England, China, Russia, you know, and that is the case. But there's also this idea of these beings that are over it. And then there's also this idea of that they don't worship God. Does that make sense? They don't worship the one true God. They don't worship Jehovah, right? So because when God divided them at the Tower of Babel, the reason why he did was because they were worshiping other gods. And the reason why he, in Deuteronomy 32, separates them like that is he says, fine, you go worship those other gods, but Israel's mine. I choose Israel for myself. So when a Jewish person thinks of a goyim, that's what they're thinking of. They're thinking these nations that are heathen nations that worship other gods and are not the chosen ones of God. So does that give you a bigger picture of that?
It does.
Okay. What else do I want to say about that? Anyway. I know what I want to say. Eventually we're going to talk about the fullness of the Gentiles and how that fits in. Because, well, let's just go ahead and go there with that. So during the time of where they were, my brain's not working this morning, they were sent out into captivity, right? That they were taken captive by, who was the Assyrians and Babylon. Let's talk about Babylon with Nebuchadnezzar. When the temple was destroyed, remember, and Nebuchadnezzar came and took some of the people.
The best of the best.
Yeah, and that was very typical of that. But that was the dispersion. That's the word I was looking for. They were dispersed at that time. So as they went into Babylon, remember they were going to go there and they were going to be there for 70 years. Remember that was their, well, and it was their punishment. God did that to bring them back to himself. That was always God's plan, is that he would send them out to disperse them, but he was going to bring them back together because they were still chosen by him, right? But as they went out into Babylon, dear Nebuchadnezzar, with Babylon there, and then how that changed over the time, not all of them came back. Remember when, who was it? Cyrus was going to rebuild the temple.
Right.
And that was all prophesied. And he tells Daniel he's going to rebuild the temple. And so then they go out and they start to rebuild the temple. And some of the Jews start going back to Jerusalem. Many of them chose not to come back.
Well, Daniel didn't go back. Right? Daniel didn't go back to Israel.
Yeah, but there were many people who chose to stay in Babylon because they liked Babylon. Many Jewish people, that's what I'm getting at with that. Daniel chose just because he was a prophet. It's not that...
And he was really, really old. I don't know.
And, but the people chose not to go back because they liked Babylon.
Well, they had assimilated into that culture.
Yes.
And they didn't want to leave.
Yes, exactly. That's the picture that I'm giving you on this. And so that's where we got the division in the tribes of Judah. Or not of Judah, the division of the tribes of Israel, I should say. Because they got divided up into two tribes. You had the two, which was Judah and Benjamin, I believe. And then you had the other 10. And so, and that's this idea that they were mixed up in all of these other, in the Babylonian culture and some of the other cultures as well.
Well, they went to Africa. There were a lot
Ethiopia.
Ethiopia. There were a lot down there because that's where the guy that carried the cross came from. And for Jesus, the guy that carried the cross for Jesus.
Okay. I was not following you what you were talking about.
But anyway, so they were dispersed all over, and that's
that.
yeah. And what's happening now is all of those that have been dispersed, they're starting to find them and they're bringing them back, and now they're overburdened. Have you heard that?
Yes, I have.
Yeah. So now Israel can't handle all of the ones that have come back, and they're
That's right.
sending them back
Yeah.
to their country, so,
That's what's going on right now.
yeah, right
Yeah.
this
I
minute.
mean, you don't have to answer this right now, but how do you know that that guy was from Ethiopia?
Oh, well, actually, I've read that, where did I get that? I got that, I'll
See,
refine it.
that's the kind of stuff I don't know
No.
how people find
No,
out.
I'll refine it, I'll refine it for you.
Okay. That's-
It has to do with his name, which ties him back to,
Oh.
the
this
tribe, and
heritage.
it was an entire teaching just on that guy who had,
Oh.
because they were talking about he had just come from a long distance, and, again, as I
Interesting.
remember it, his name tied him back to that.
And you have to,
And it maybe even said where he comes from.
yeah, I don't know, I don't remember.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
But you have to remember too, what was going on during that time. That was the time of Passover.
Passover.
And there were 3 times that they were required to go back to Jerusalem. Passover was that. So if he was from Ethiopia and he was one of those tribes, that's why he was
He was
traveled
that
such
makes
a long
sense.
distance to come back, was because of the feast that was going on at that
Makes
time.
sense.
So anyway, getting back to the word Gentiles, nations, and goyim is, there's also that picture of the lost, what we call the lost tribe
Oh,
of Israel. What?
he's a man of Cyrene, Cyrene.
And so you could probably
Simon
trace
by
that.
name.
Yeah,
Simon by name. So
trace that back to the
to
tribe.
where, yeah, to where it came from.
I've heard that, but I can't tell you.
All the details,
Well-
there's quite a few details actually once you start that.
Yeah, that's what I don't always know how to find it.
Yeah, it's,
I'll just go online and ask, I'll go online and say, story of man from Cyrene and Simon, and you'll get enough hits that eventually you can
mhm,
trace it down to
yeah,
who did all the legwork.
okay.
Interesting.
Gentiles and Goyim and nations. So there's also the picture of the lost tribe, the people who decided not to come back are also considered Goyim. They're also considered, because they're considered heathen now. They're not part, they're not pure, they're not clean, they're not, does that make sense?
Mhm.
So sometimes that's mixed in with it too, that we don't think about as Christian readers of the Bible. We don't think of it that way. We just think of nations as Russia and China and those kinds of stuff. But it has a bigger picture than that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so where were we? Talking about the temple. Let's read some of these scriptures on the temple, because the argument is, and I want to share this too. Studying chapter 11 in Revelation, when you go to read commentaries, again, I've said this before, you can find commentaries that just spread out in all different directions. And chapter 11 is probably the most difficult one, because there's so many different interpretations. And many commentators will say that it's probably the most confusing chapter in Revelation. And one of them is the temple in here, because like I said, Joella, when we were talking about the measuring rod, what it was, the question really is what is the temple? Not really what is the measuring rod, but what is the temple that's being talked about here? So I want to read these scriptures and show you that there's more about the temple than just rebuilding the third temple in Jerusalem. Most people will say that, but this is a sign. It's actually a real temple. So we have to ask, is it temple in heaven, or is it the third temple going to be rebuilt here on earth, or is it something else? So there's 3 different things it could be. From what I read in this, it can't be the temple in heaven, because it talks about the Gentiles in verse 2, omitting that, for it is given over to the Gentiles, and they will trample the holy city underfoot for 42 months. So if it was in heaven, it couldn't be the heavenly temple, right? So we have to kind of just mark, through doing that, we have to kind of mark that one off. So could it be an earthly temple, or could it be another type of, a spiritualized temple is what they see. So the other thing I want to say is that